Alright, the subject is going to be something different from what I usually do. We're going to talk about salvaging old computers. And of course you can guess what this is. This is a motherboard. It's from an E-machine. The BIOS and everything I've found on it says it was built in the early 2000s. I'm guessing it's 15 years old. What good is a 15-year-old machine? This thing happens to have a dual-core 3 gig processor and I found 2.6 gig of memory to fit it. Of course, it's not the most modern, up-to-date thing, but you can still do a lot of things even with the older computers, particularly if you want to learn to write computer programs or how to get around in hardware and so forth. So let's consider some capabilities here. Of course, before I went anywhere, I checked it to see if it would boot up and give me, at least come up and say, where's my hard drive or something like that. So it does boot up, which means it does largely work, most of it. The first thing is to observe is what connectors. Oh, okay, let's do the first thing. Let's say this thing is 15 years old. The first thing I do is chuck this battery. It's dead nearly all the time. You can't set up the BIOS properly with a dead battery. The next thing is to consider what kind of hard drives and cables and hardware does it use. If you see these two connectors here, these are known as IDE connectors. They've been around for years. Here is the hard drive that fits it. I have about 20 of them. That's the type hard drive it uses. Your modern computers use SATA drives, which is this type of connector. You have a small cable there and a power cable. This is the cable that connects to the SATA drives. This is the cable that connects to the IDE drives. On this particular board, there are no connectors for SATA drives. That's a minus. The plus is I have plenty of IDE CD-ROMs, burners, and hard drives. Got plenty of them. The next thing to notice is your connectors here. I have 3 PCI connectors, a lot of hardware out there that fits that still. This is an AGP video board connector. Those are hard to find, but it turns out the board has its own video built in, and it's a very good chipset. It's an Intel, and it has a Pentium, like I said, it has a Pentium 4 dual core 3 gigahertz processor. This board is Intel through and through. Alright, so we got it up to boot, and it looks like it's worth having. I have plenty of hardware to fit this. I have memory. So we power it up and start checking it out even closer. The first thing I find wrong, let me check some. The CPU fan isn't running. And of course the CPU is going to get hot and the system will shut down. Not good. Your first reaction is, and it's usually, if you can sit here and put your finger on it, and this thing is obviously not gunked up or frozen up because it's choked up with dirt. If you're salvaging these boards, take the fans off, blow them out, take the heat sinks off, and use some 409 or something and clean all the garbage out of it. A lot of them that have been on for years, I'll sit here and you're just pouring out the dirt, lint, and stuff that's clogged up in it. But of course the CPU fan wasn't running. Okay, I checked another CPU fan and plugged it into the connectors on the board. Nothing. This is the third board I have found where the CPU cooling fan circuit that varies the fan speed depending on temperature has quit working. Fan is fine. CPU is fine. The easiest hack to get it fixed is you take off the CPU fan. It has 3 wires. You take the red and the black wire, as you see there, and I hooked them up to the red and the black in the unused floppy drive cable. I'm not using floppy drives, but this power supply has a connector for a floppy drive, and it's, wow, it's handy. I use a couple of these little pins I just push into the connector and they fit right together. And so that fixed the CPU fan problem. Alright, in operating the board, you notice this big heat sink here. This gets hot. And while it runs fine like it is, it can, over the time, degrade the board. One of the biggest things that kills a lot of motherboards, from what I've found, see these capacitors? What happens is you have a switching power supply built onto the motherboard, and it will step it down, and it'll be at a pretty high current to operate your CPU. The heat eventually degrades and destroys these capacitors, and the board dies. And other than mass replacement of the capacitors, might bring it back up. In this case, these are not in bad shape. That one's been a little, if you look like it's sort of been bubbled up, that means it's been hot. But apparently there's no problem with this yet. This runs hot. And so what I did with the case, and this is an old Salvage case, is I have plenty of these large CPU fans. I velcroed these wood blocks to the inside of the case. It's a 12-volt fan. I got a bunch of them for a few dollars. And I hooked it to the 12-volt side of the floppy cable. So the 5-volt side goes to the CPU fan, runs fine. No problem. I used the 12-volt side to run the auxiliary cooling fan, which will blow air across the board and keep this cool. Alright, so far so good. The board has a lot of great features. It has good video. It has 8 USB 2.0 ports, printer port, 2 serial connectors. You can still use your PS2 keyboards and mice. And I ran my Linux up in it, said everything was working right, plugged in my audio amplifier to the audio, and that the onboard audio is no good. Must be a problem probably in this connector. Who knows? The Linux says the chips are working, the software end of it's working, so that's just peachy. Like I said, I'm using this here for I'm using this particular setup for cloning hard drives and writing software and other things. And I like to check out the audio on things as well. So I went into the BIOS, disabled the onboard audio, and guess what? I have a box of PCI audio cards, and that fixed it. So that was the fix. The fan fix, the audio fix, and the excess heat problem was also fixed with an auxiliary fan. You can learn a lot by doing this stuff, and if you're one of these environmental types and not just turning it into politics, this saves resources. I would estimate to manufacture this board probably took 2 or 3 tons of coal. That's how much energy it takes to make this stuff. And it's a perfectly good piece of salvageable hardware. And I've got a box of motherboards that I play with, seeing just what kind of software I can get to work on them. You You may even be able to run Windows 10 on this. I doubt if you can find Windows 10 drivers for it. That's the other problem when they go, but Linux solves the problem. I'm sold on Linux. Mr. Gates can keep his software system. And so that's what this discussion was, a few tricks and hacks to bring back an old motherboard. We'll be looking at some more of this as we go along. Thanks for listening.